At my dad's 60th, he gave a speech thanking everyone, except me. When I raised my glass anyway, he snorted and said, "Don't act like you belong here." My mom laughed. "You never did." I didn't flinch. I just handed him a small box and said, "Open it when you're ready to tell the truth." He rolled his eyes, but when he lifted the lid, he dropped it like it burned. My sister stared at me and whispered, "How long have you known this?" I, 32M, still remember the exact moment everything changed at Dad's 60th birthday party. The whole family had gathered at their house, about 40 people packed into the living room and spilling onto the back patio. Dad stood there with his whiskey, giving one of his trademark speeches, thanking everyone who'd shaped his life. He went through the usual suspects. Mom for being his rock, my sister for making him proud with her medical career, his brothers for always having his back, his old business partners. Even the neighbors got a mention. But when his eyes swept over me, sitting right there in the front row, they just kept moving like I was invisible. The silence stretched as he wrapped up, raising his glass to toast everyone who mattered. Everyone except the son who'd been there for 32 years. The murmurs started immediately. Aunt Helen shot me a sympathetic look. My cousins shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. I stood up anyway, raising my beer bottle. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was desperation, but I wasn't going to let him erase me completely. The room went dead quiet. Dad's face twisted into that familiar sneer I'd grown up with. He actually snorted and said I shouldn't act like I belonged there. The words hit like a physical blow, but I stayed standing. Then Mom, my own mother, laughed from her chair beside him and announced that I never did belong. 40 pairs of eyes were on me. Some pitying, some embarrassed, some just curious to see how the family scapegoat would react this time. But I didn't flinch. I'd been preparing for this moment longer than they could imagine. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, the kind jewelry comes in. Dad's eyes narrowed as I walked over and placed it in his palm. I told him to open it when he was ready to tell the truth. He rolled his eyes and made some comment about my dramatics, but I could see the curiosity eating at him. Mom was still smirking, probably expecting another one of my desperate attempts to win their approval. My sister just looked confused, watching the whole scene unfold. Dad flipped the box open with theatrical exaggeration, probably planning to mock whatever was inside. But the moment he saw the contents, his face went white. The box slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. The small DNA test results printout scattered across the hardwood. My sister was the first to break the stunned silence, whispering how long I'd known. Her medical training probably helped her understand what she was seeing faster than everyone else. I'd known for 6 months. It started when I needed my birth certificate for a passport renewal and found my adoption papers mixed in with Mom's files. 28 years later, I discovered I wasn't actually their biological son. They'd adopted me as an infant and never bothered to tell me. But that wasn't the bomb I dropped at the party. The DNA results showed something else entirely. They showed that Dad wasn't just not my biological father. He was my biological uncle. My real father was his brother Michael, Uncle Mike, who died in a car accident when I was 3. The same Uncle Mike that Dad had spent 30 years telling everyone was his hero. The same brother he'd named his boat after. The same man whose picture sat on their mantle while my school photos got shoved in drawers. I'd put the pieces together slowly. Uncle Mike had gotten his girlfriend pregnant right before he died. That girlfriend was apparently someone Dad couldn't stand, based on the family stories I'd overheard over the years. When Mike died, Dad and Mom had taken in his baby, me, but they'd never forgiven me for being Mike's son with the wrong woman. Everything made sense now. Why Dad always compared me unfavorably to Uncle Mike, saying I'd never measure up. Why Mom always acted like loving me was a burden. Why they poured everything into my sister while treating me like an obligation. The room was spinning around us. Aunt Helen had picked up the DNA results and was reading them with wide eyes. Uncle Pete was staring at Dad like he'd never seen him before. My cousins were whispering frantically to each other. Dad finally found his voice and demanded to know where I'd gotten those papers. His tone was different now, not dismissive, but panicked. I told him I'd gotten them the same place I'd learned about my real parents. From Grandma's journals before she died. That was another lie, but a calculated one. Grandma had left me a box of photos and letters when she passed 2 years ago. Dad had tried to intercept it, but she'd been specific in her will that it came to me directly. I'd assumed it was just sentimental stuff and hadn't opened it until after I found the adoption papers. Inside were letters between Grandma and Uncle Mike's girlfriend, Sarah. Letters about the pregnancy. Letters about Mike's joy at becoming a father. Letters about how Dad had convinced Sarah to give me up after Mike died, promising she could stay in touch, but then cutting her off completely once the adoption was finalized. Sarah had tried to contact me for years through Grandma. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone. Grandma had kept every letter, every photo Sarah sent, every update about how she never stopped thinking about the son she'd been forced to give up. The DNA test had just confirmed what the letters already told me. Dad wasn't my father, but he'd spent 3 decades punishing me for existing anyway. Mom had gone completely silent, which was unusual for her. She was staring at the papers like they might explode. My sister kept looking between us, her medical mind probably calculating timelines and family history. I announced that I'd found my real mother, Sarah. She lived about 2 hours away and had never remarried, never had other kids. She'd spent 30 years wondering what happened to the son she'd lost. Dad's face was pure rage now. He started yelling about how I had no right to go digging up the past, how I was destroying the family with my selfishness. But his anger felt different this time, desperate instead of authoritative. I cut him off and asked why he'd lied. Why he'd let me grow up thinking I was his disappointing son instead of his nephew who'd lost his real father. Why he'd erased Mike's girlfriend from the story entirely. The truth came out in angry fragments. Dad admitted he'd hated Sarah from the moment Mike introduced her. She was everything he thought his brother deserved better than, young, from the wrong side of town, working at a diner instead of college. When Mike died and left her pregnant, Dad saw it as his chance to clean up what he saw as Mike's mistake. He'd convinced her that keeping the baby would be selfish, that she couldn't provide the stability a child needed. He and Mom would raise me properly, give me opportunities Sarah never could. But the deal was that she had to disappear completely. No contact, no confusion about who my real parents were. What Dad hadn't counted on was how much I'd remind him of Mike every single day. Every time he looked at me, he saw his dead brother's face mixed with features from a woman he'd despised. Instead of loving Mike's son, he'd resented me for existing. Mom finally spoke up, her voice shaking. She said they tried to love me like their own, but it was complicated. I looked too much like Mike, acted too much like him. Every milestone I hit reminded them of what Mike would never get to experience. My sister was crying now, probably realizing how differently we'd been treated our whole lives. She asked why they'd never told her either. Mom explained they'd wanted to protect the family secret, didn't want complications or divided loyalties. I told them about my phone call with Sarah the week before, how her voice had broken when I told her who I was, how she'd kept every photo Grandma had secretly sent over the years, how she'd never stopped loving the baby she'd been forced to give up. Dad's anger shifted to panic. He demanded to know if I was planning to destroy everything they'd built. I asked him what exactly they'd built. A family where one child got unconditional love while the other got treated like a burden? The party guests were starting to slip away, sensing this was too personal for an audience. But the core family stayed, trapped in this moment of reckoning. Uncle Pete, Mike's other brother, finally spoke. He said he'd always wondered what happened to Mike's girlfriend after the funeral. Dad had told everyone she'd decided adoption was best and wanted a clean break. Pete had respected that, but he'd always felt something was off about the story. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photo Sarah had sent me. It was her holding infant me in the hospital, tears streaming down her face. She looked like she was being torn apart, not like someone making a happy choice for her child's future. My sister studied the photo and quietly noted that Sarah couldn't have been more than 19. A teenager who'd just lost the father of her baby, being pressured by adults who thought they knew better. The room fell quiet, as everyone absorbed the full scope of what had happened. Dad and Mom hadn't just adopted me. They'd separated a teenage mother from her child through manipulation and then spent 30 years punishing me for existing. I announced my decision. I was moving closer to Sarah, starting fresh with the parent who'd actually wanted me. I'd already given notice at my job and found an apartment near her town. Dad's composure finally cracked completely. He started yelling about ingratitude, about everything they'd sacrificed, about how I was destroying the family over ancient history. But his words felt hollow now. Everyone could see the truth. Mom tried a different approach, talking about family loyalty and how we could work through this. But when I asked if she was ready to apologize for 30 years of treating me like an unwanted obligation, She went quiet again. My sister surprised everyone by standing up and saying she was going with me to meet Sarah. She wanted to meet her real aunt, to understand the family history that had been hidden from her too. That's when Dad really lost it. He screamed that we were both being manipulated, that Sarah was probably just after money now that we were adults. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and desperate. I reminded him that Sarah didn't even know I'd found her until last week. She'd spent 30 years respecting the boundaries he'd forced on her, never trying to interfere with the life he'd promised to give me. Uncle Pete asked the question everyone was thinking. How many other family secrets were buried under Dad's version of events? What other people had been erased from the family story to keep things neat and simple? Update 1. The aftermath of Dad's party spread through the extended family like wildfire. Within days, I was getting calls from cousins and aunts I hadn't heard from in months, all wanting to know what really happened. The most shocking call came from Aunt Janet, Uncle Mike's ex-wife from before he met Sarah. She told me she'd been wondering about Mike's son for decades, but had been told to respect the family's privacy. When she heard about the party revelation, she broke down crying. Janet revealed that Mike had called her the week before he died, excited about becoming a father. He'd talked about wanting to be different from Dad, about breaking the cycle of emotional distance that had marked their family for generations. Mike had apparently seen how Dad treated people as disposable when they didn't meet his standards. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. Dad had actually prevented Sarah from attending Mike's funeral. He'd told her it would be too emotional for everyone involved, especially with her pregnancy. Sarah had spent 30 years thinking Mike's family had rejected her completely. I called Sarah and told her what Janet had shared. She was quiet for a long time before admitting she'd always wondered why no one from Mike's family had reached out after the funeral. She'd assumed they blamed her for getting pregnant, for somehow contributing to Mike's death by being a distraction. My sister had kept her word about meeting Sarah. We drove up together the following weekend, both of us nervous but determined. Sarah lived in a small house filled with photos she'd kept of Mike, including some I'd never seen. She'd preserved an entire room of things she'd bought for me as a baby, items she'd never been able to give me. The meeting was emotional, but not in the way I'd expected. Sarah didn't try to replace the parents who'd raised me or demand instant closeness. She just wanted to know me, to understand who I'd become. We talked for hours about Mike, about her life, about the years of wondering. What struck me most was how different her stories about Mike were from the sanitized version Dad had always told. In Sarah's version, Mike was funny but flawed, ambitious but sometimes reckless. He was human in a way Dad's hero worship had never allowed. She also shared Mike's letters from the months before he died. He'd been planning to propose after the baby was born. He'd been looking at bigger apartments, talking about starting his own business so he could provide better for his new family. His death hadn't just ended his life. It had destroyed the future he'd been building. Update 2. 3 weeks after the party, Dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't let him in, but curiosity won. He looked like he'd aged years in the past month. He tried to start with justifications, how he and Mom had given me a good life, how Sarah couldn't have provided what I needed, how family secrets sometimes protected people. But when I asked him directly if he was apologizing, he couldn't answer. Instead, he told me something that explained everything. The night Mike died, he'd been driving to Dad's house for a family dinner. Sarah was supposed to come too, her first time meeting the extended family. Mike had been calling Dad from the car, excited and nervous about introducing his pregnant girlfriend. Dad admitted he'd been cold on that phone call. He'd made comments about Mike needing to be more responsible, about hoping this girlfriend was more suitable than his previous choices. The call had ended with tension between them, and those were the last words they'd ever spoken. Mike died 20 minutes later when a drunk driver ran a red light. Dad had spent 30 years carrying guilt about their final conversation, and seeing me, Mike's son, was a constant reminder of the brother he'd failed and the words he could never take back. He'd convinced himself that controlling my adoption was a way to make up for failing Mike. By giving me a better life than Sarah could provide, he was somehow honoring his brother's memory. But every day I looked more like Mike, acted more like him, and Dad's guilt turned into resentment. It was twisted logic, but it made sense of 30 years of confusing behavior. Dad hadn't been rejecting me personally. He'd been rejecting his own guilt and failure. But the result was the same either way. I told him I understood his guilt, but that it didn't justify what he'd done to Sarah or to me. He'd made decisions based on his own emotional needs, not what was actually best for the people involved. Dad asked if there was any way to fix things. I told him the first step would be apologizing to Sarah for the lies and manipulation. He went quiet at that, probably realizing he'd have to face the woman he'd wronged for 3 decades. Update 3. The family gathering for Christmas was unlike any we'd ever had. Dad had finally called Sarah and arranged a meeting. It took place at Uncle Pete's house, neutral territory for everyone involved. Sarah came with a box of letters and photos she'd wanted to share for 30 years. Dad came with what might have been the first genuine apology of his life. Mom stayed home, still unable to face the woman whose child she'd helped raise while resenting his existence. The conversation was painful but necessary. Dad admitted to the manipulation and control. Sarah shared how the forced separation had affected her life, how she'd struggled with depression and guilt for years. Uncle Pete and Aunt Helen listened to family history they'd never heard before. My sister had spent weeks going through old family photos and realized how many had been edited or excluded over the years. Pictures of Mike and Sarah together, photos from before I was born that might have raised questions about the family timeline. Dad had curated our family history to support his version of events. The most surprising moment came when Sarah thanked Dad for raising me well, despite everything. She said she could see Mike in my character, his kindness, his sense of humor, his loyalty. She wasn't angry about the life I'd had. She was angry about being erased from it. Dad broke down then, really broke down. He admitted he'd been wrong about Sarah from the beginning. She'd been young, but she'd loved Mike genuinely, and she'd loved me enough to believe she was doing what was best by letting him and Mom raise me. We worked out a new arrangement. I would split time between my life near Sarah and staying connected to my sister and the extended family who'd supported me. Dad and I would work on rebuilding our relationship, but it would be based on honesty this time. Mom eventually joined us for dinner later that evening. She was quieter than usual, but she made an effort to talk to Sarah about Mike and their early relationship. It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't hostility either. As I looked around the table that night, Sarah finally getting to know the son she'd lost, my sister learning about the uncle she barely remembered, Dad facing the consequences of his choices, I realized this was what family could actually look like. Messy and complicated, but honest. The little wooden box that had started everything sat empty on Uncle Pete's mantel, next to a new photo of Mike holding infant me that Sarah had brought. Some secrets destroy families when they come to light. But sometimes, they're just the lies that were destroying the family all along.